welcome to the April webinar on producer licensing best practices. My name is Julie Mendel and I am the Education Trustee for the SILA Foundation. Before introducing our panel of speakers, I have a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. This webinar is 1 hour in length and is being recorded. Please put your questions in the chat box and the panel will address as many as possible at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time and you still have questions, we will address them via email. Within the next week, you will receive a link to the recording and a post-webinar survey. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you our panel of 4 experts with a combined 81 years of experience in the industry. Today, we have Danny Fields D'Amato, who is a compliance officer focused on licensing, core compliance policies, and professional standards adherence. Nikki Brown is experienced in licensing that includes producer, adjuster, service contract, and portable electronics licensing.
Exit out. Okay, exit out.
Lonnie Eichner brings her insurance industry and experience as a director of compliance to the table this afternoon. And we're very excited to include a special guest speaker, NIPR's Tiffany Dunges, who oversees teams that provide daily support and service to all states and jurisdictions. She operates as a liaison between NIPR, regulators, and their vendors. So please join me in welcoming this quartet of experts to our virtual stage. Go ahead, Danny.
Oh, thanks. Okay, here we go. Lonnie. All right.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
That's okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The attendance and interest in this is really great. We're going to share today what best practices are based on our combined experience and years of information gathering by the various SILA groups and task forces. Remember that the information provided is not to be considered legal advice in any manner, and we strongly encourage you to consult with your licensing, contracting, hiring legal teams before implementing changes. Also, remember that being a SILA member provides you with access to invaluable resources, including reference charts, the best practice handbook, and we're going to take you through the producer lifecycle and discuss how to maintain compliance while navigating the state rules. Danny's going to start us off with a quick history lesson of insurance licensing.
Thanks so much, Lonnie. So producer licensing is regulated. Sorry, we got a little interference there. Just a reminder, everybody should be muted. If I think everybody's naturally muted, but if you, in case there's a way around that, if you wouldn't mind muting until the end or until it's your turn to speak. Thank you. So hi, everybody, I'm Danny. As you know, producer licensing is regulated at the state level. And if you can imagine, just 25 years ago, if a producer or an agent or broker wanted to be licensed in other states, they'd actually have to go satisfy that other state's licensing requirements as well. In the early days of non-resident licensing, the process was really manual. It was paper-driven. It was completely non-uniform. And then industry changes, technology, and believe it or not, regulations sparked needed change. And here are some historical highlights. The National Insurance Producer Registry, or NIPR, was one of the very first things that helped us along the way. It was originally called the Insurance Registry Information Network, or IRIN, and they later named it the familiar NIPR. It's a public-private effort officially incorporated in October of 1996 by the NAIC as a nonprofit affiliate to develop and operate as a national repository for producer licensing information. They created and operate the producer database, which we could not live without. The PDB is a central repository of producer licensing information updated on a timely basis by participating state insurance departments. Currently, the PDB includes information from all 50 states, DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the USVI, and it's the industry's source of truth. We are, as we mentioned, lucky to have Tiffany Dunges from the NIPR join us later on. Some regulations that help propel licensing forward, Graham Leach Bliley of 1999, or GLEBA, as it may be lovingly referred to, a provision in that act aimed to streamline producer licensing by requiring the states to enact reform to the insurance producer licensing process. The provision was designed to create a new organization called the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers, or NARAB. And it was similar to federal oversight. If greater state producer licensing uniformity or reciprocity was not met by a date certain, and they gave a number on that. They said 29 jurisdictions by November 2002, that NARAB would go into action and take some of the oversight that the states had. So it sparked a nationwide movement to implement sweeping reforms to simply bring more efficiency to the producer licensing process. It helped lead us to the Producer Licensing Model Act, which in the early 2000s, in 2005, changed the game. It provided a model to promote uniform state licensing procedures for producer licensing. It is the model law that is still the basis for our uniformity standards now. It provides the qualifications and procedures for licensing of insurance producers. It simplifies and organizes some of the statutory language to improve efficiency and permits the use of new technology, reducing costs associated with issuing and renewing insurance licenses. But wait, there's still some more regulation. In 2015, the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers Reform Act, or NARAB 2, as it's commonly called, was enacted as part of HR 26, which was the TRIA, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. That is intended to streamline the non-resident producer licensing process even further, still preserving the state's rights. So it would have the ability to protect consumers and regulate producer conduct. NARAB 2 does not create federal regulator, but it does establish an independent nonprofit corporation known as NARAB and controlled by its board of directors. The stated purpose of the legislation was to provide a mechanism through which licensing, continuing education, and other non-resident insurance producer qualification requirements and conditions may be adopted and applied on a multi-state basis without affecting the laws, rules, and regs, and preserving the rights of the states, especially when it comes to conduct. It was signed in 2016, but NARAB 2 sort of remained stalled because the approval of the board stopped. So its future is not clear, but in the meantime, we move forward and have lots of best practices to help guide us along the way. All right, just a quick note about SILA's organization. So SILA, the Securities Insurance Licensing Association, brings together licensing experts whose occupations encompass all aspects of insurance licensing and securities registration. So that includes, but is not limited to, the licensing and registration of agents, agencies, adjusters, brokers, companies, producers, securities dealers, and third-party administrators, and auxiliary occupations as administration, regulation, testing, education, publishing, and reporting as related to the financial services industry. I have been a member for many years, and there are so many valuable resources. So if licensing falls under your purview or it's something of interest to you, I really recommend taking a look at our organization. There are so many tools. As we speak about our best practices today that we have followed throughout our career, you'll hear us refer back to SILA's library of resources that were created mostly by the industry, including the Best Practices Handbook, which is a living resource that we as members maintain. Now, Nikki will share some of her best practices in the producer lifecycle.
So the first producer lifecycle, as we all know, is a person's identified that they need to be licensed as data collection. So in my experience, one of the things that we have done in the past is create what's called a data sheet. So there might be a variety of different names that different large organizations may call it, or small agencies, but essentially it's just a collection of data, all the general different demographic information that applications may require. Fingerprinting may be required, and you collect all of that information. The other part to it is that typically it will have an outline of all of the background questions that are going to be asked of that producer during the application process. So this could be, as some of us are familiar with, the NRAI background questions, general uniform background questions that are offered on the NRAI applications. And it could be a variety of additional state-specific questions depending on how your organization has decided that that particular person needs to be licensed. But you create either a sheet, or anymore these days, it could be a form that's within a system that you would first be notified. In the past, we've been notified from HR and or other managers of different groups. And then our pre-licensing group or individual who is in charge of collecting that data would have sent out a form or an actual, when I first started, it was a PDF form that you literally wrote and scanned back in. But it had since then changed to a Microsoft, form that we could send a link for, and then they could send the information back to us. But essentially, you're doing that data collection. And what this does is allows for whoever is in charge of, and this would be for probably a larger organization who is handling and managing the licensing for several different folks. It gives them the ability to be able to answer those background questions how you would answer it if you were applying yourself. There are other technology options, and you will hear a little bit about these throughout the presentation. But you can have there are systems out there now. Most of them are either homegrown systems or a vendor who offers licensing management services that are tied to that producer database or that PDB that Danny was speaking about. And if they're previously licensed, then it will automatically bring in that information, which would then lessen your need for any additional data collection. If that's not the case, some folks will actually enter that information manually or hire another group to do that. Or, it's just a variety of different ways you can do it, but it's just that main first document of data collection that you're looking for to get that licensing information acquired so that you can apply. Then we go, so once you've collected all the data, right, there's going to be a process of pre-licensing exams, which is going to be spoken about as well. But we have, your resident and your non-resident license. And the thing that if you are new to the insurance industry, you may be aware that in order for you to sell, solicit, negotiate, transact, or place business of any kind regarding insurance, you have to have a license, and that is state driven. So wherever it is that you reside wherever your residency is, you will obtain what's called a resident license. So you'll hear that in the industry quite a bit, a resident and a non-resident license. So you'll obtain that resident license first, and then depending on every business has a different approach and a different angle to it. In some of the past places I've worked, it really comes down to if that person is selling, soliciting, negotiating, placing, or transacting business in a given state, they need to be licensed. And so everybody's policy is a little bit different on that, but that's just the general rule that you'll hear the industry talk about. I'm going to pass this over to Lonnie now, who's going to speak a little bit more about this from the carrier perspective.
Okay, so from a carrier side of things, when you're thinking of the onboarding, it's more for the contracting and appointing process. And there's a few things that are best practice tools that I would just like to share. There's a subgroup in SILA, the SACS committee, also known as the agency carrier subgroup, and they have gathered a bunch of best practices. And one of those is the Accord 821 form, or the PIF, the producer information form. And that is used actually to initiate the relationship between the producer and the carrier. A lot of carriers have their own versions of contracts or intake, onboarding types of things, but they should all include the recommended background questions, and also important to get an authorization for the carrier to run a background check, as well as any supporting documentation, such as proof of product trainings, errors and omissions, commission-specific forms, such as the W-9 and agent agreement. these are the best way for a carrier to protect themselves from, allowing producers that they would not selling their products to sell their products. So most states, I mean, it varies among states. However, it does kind of come down to the carrier is responsible for what that producer does as they're representing them and selling their products. Another additional tool that carriers can utilize is called Vector One. And Vector One is a subscription database comprised of producers who hold commission-related debit balances. It's something that carriers can use to check to see when they are getting a new agent contracted with them, to see if they've got a history of having balance with previous carriers. And they also have the ability to then report any debit balances that they have not been able to collect to Vector One for the use of other industry providers.
Awesome. From our perspective, I also represent the agency side of things for a large organization. And our data collection really is a connectivity to HR. We identify job roles that should likely require a license. We are deliberately more inclusive, right? So we might capture some people that don't actually need a license for their current job role. And then we vet those people to see what their role is and what licenses they need. And, many times in this industry, people are coming to us already licensed. So we do also, I wanted to mention, pull a current PDB report on those colleagues and pull it directly into our system. Our technology allows for that because we use a vendor that's connected to NIPR. But recognizing that there could be some smaller mom and pop type agencies, certainly that could be done at a much smaller level, but still using the technology that's available via the NIPR. So you would pull a PDB on anybody who's already licensed to see where they're licensed and have that current information. And I also wanted to just touch on a compliance policy / producer agreement. So the producer agreement, we usually have that driven by our carrier partners, but the compliance policy is something that every organization should have if you're a regulated industry. And, if you're not in charge of writing such policy, then that's lucky. But you should obviously look to the law, right? And the Producer Licensing Model Act definitions and make sure those are included in the policy. All right. Go ahead.
That slide real quick, Danny.
Yeah.
On pre-licensing, and I think Lonnie touched base a little bit on it from a carrier perspective, but another, I guess, sort of best practice that we have used in the past is specific to background questions. So once a person has gone through their pre-licensing education in their resident state, taken an exam, passed the exam, you start to apply. You get that resident license and it issues. We will typically take the approach of applying if a person is going to be licensed nationwide or close to that, which is probably common today with as much technology and electronic processing that we do in the insurance industry. Many people are getting licenses across the country. What we will do is we would apply essentially for non-resident licenses in states where we know they have a very thorough background process. And this will basically allow for us to, if things were not disclosed correctly on their data sheet, or they did not, disclose what they needed to, or they didn't answer the question correctly, it will identify if there are any background questions. And at that point, then what you can do is address that with those states, and then get the documentation that you need that will allow them to get that license issued in that state, and then apply for all their non-resident licenses based upon answering the questions the way that they should have originally been answered with that background issue at hand. And you would also have the documentation that you can upload to the NIPR documents warehouse, and it will allow for that non-resident, those licenses to issue a little more smoothly versus having to go back and disclose all of this information to non-resident states that you've applied for but didn't realize the person had a background issue. So definitely a good best practice, and will save you a lot of time, effort, and heartache when it comes to licensing folks.
I also noticed that helping the producers through the background questionnaire with some thoughtful natural language questions or probes is helpful, right? Because sometimes somebody got in trouble like in college and it was really, they in their mind, it was like a ticket or something, but really there's a mark on their background that would turn up in, say, one of the more strict states. So just helping them understand what the nature of the question is. And we always tell them, when in doubt, air it out. All right, next slide.
Well, I think I pick up with this one, talking about sort of the maintenance side of things. So you have onboarding, got a new producer, a producer that's already licensed, and you get them licensed appropriately the way you need. Well, there's always maintenance that comes along with licensing. And the first thing that we have always implemented is what's called a license audit. It can be called a variety of different things, but essentially a way for you to be scrubbing people's license records that are licensed, just to see, hey, are they licensed appropriately for the role that they're in? I came from an organization that had 10,000 names for 10,000 different positions, and having a licensing audit process in place was very helpful to ensuring that we had folks licensed the way that they needed to, although it always seemed to be a moving target, just like compliance is. So part of that audit process is usually around the time of a person's resident license renewal. So most resident license, well, good majority of insurance licenses are fairly uniform, and they will either renew every 2 years, some are 3, and then some are perpetual, and you always have a few exceptions to the rule. The majority of them renew every 2 years. At that time, that producer is going to have to take their CE in their resident state. Every state requires CE. I shouldn't say ever, there's always an exception to the rule, but I know I'm licensed in Missouri and I have to do CE every 2 years in order to keep that resident license active. During that time is when we would send out what was called a renewal questionnaire. Again, it can be a document called something else, but essentially what this is all of that general demographic information that you would have asked for during the time that the person was onboarding, with the exception of adding the background questions would be a little different, because the NEIC has differently worded renewal background questions than they do on the initial application. So we replaced those initial application questions with the renewal questions, and then identified if there were state-specific questions that also needed to be asked during that time. And that producer would fill that form out and essentially answer all of the questions. This is forms or a document or questionnaire that sort of gets created over time, because the applications could be changing and things need to be added, or you identify things that need to be added and you add it. But essentially you're filling that out. Part of that had the person's position on it. And so our team had a templated idea of different people's positions and how they needed to be licensed. And we would use that template, which had Excel, rules, essentially, there's another word for it. Excel rules that you would fill in all of that table with the person's current licensing information that's in your database. And what that would do is then identify where licenses needed to be applied for and licenses needed to be surrendered. This is really good for any organization, especially any of us who are looking to save money on our annual budgets. I know past our licensing budget is really large. So it's just a good way to be, to be able to have those records updated to allow you to be a good steward of the funds that you have. So that renewal questionnaire would be filled out. And then we would essentially apply or surrender licenses that needed to be surrendered. The standard rule is for best practice, in my experience, is that we would always maintain a producer's resident license because they've taken an exam there, regardless of whether or not they were in a licensed or a non-licensed role. So that's sort of how our auditing process has, and then it kind of not spirals, but then dominoes into other areas. So then you've got new appointments perhaps, or new affiliations, which the next thing I was going to talk about is the affiliation process. So we're just going to segue right into that. Our affiliation process, generally from an agency perspective, what an affiliation is, if you're not familiar, is the relationship between the agent, the licensed agent, and their agency. So essentially what it is telling other folks is, hey, this is the agency that I work for. And what this does is the goal is to basically increase that consumer protection by not only holding the licensed producer accountable, but also the agency that they belong to. The really rough thing about affiliations is they're not uniform in any way whatsoever. There are a few states that call it an appointment, which drives me absolutely crazy. But none of them do it all the same, and a good majority of the states don't even require it. But the states that do require it, it's a very manual process. So as a part of our auditing process and the templates that we would use for the positions, it also had sections for affiliations and appointments. And so essentially, if they needed a new license, there would also be a section that would say if an affiliation was required. And at that point, then the coordinator who was handling affiliations would be notified about that, and they would process the affiliation on behalf of that producer. It happens the same way with disaffiliations. We'll be talking about that at the end. So essentially, there's no really good best practice, ironically, on it. It's a very manual process, but if you can at least get aligned on how you are to license your folks based on their positions, which I know is way easier said than done, then you can build out templates that you can use in an auditing process that could identify to you where a person needs to be affiliated. The other part to this life cycle is your CE, which I mentioned earlier. You do have CE, and generally there are two different approaches to how CE is managed. There's either, typically smaller organizations where the producer handles and manages their own CE. So if you're a much smaller agency where you just have 8, 20 agents, right, that are licensed, those agents are going to know that they need to do their CE because their livelihood is at stake if they do not finish their CE. So you have that side, you have that approach. And then the second is for more larger firm organizations, which is one of the areas I came from. And we had dedicated licensing folks who managed a person's CE from start to finish, with the exception of actually doing their CE. So we would essentially notify the producer that they have CE that's due. We would go as far as assigning them their CE and then continuing to remind them that they needed to complete it and continue on with that follow-up process. Every firm is a little different, but if it's a larger firm and you have a licensing department that's managing it, they're going to be within that spectrum. Some of them will handle the entire process from start to finish. Others will send out reminders and leave it to the producers to finish it on their own. But the bottom line is that you have to finish your CE, because if you don't finish your CE, your resident license will go down, which then affects any non-resident licenses you have as well. Danny, from an agency perspective, did you have anything to add to any of what I just spoke about before I hand it off?
Yeah, just a couple of quick notes. You covered so much. Thank you. For licensing audits, I think one thing I wanted to mention, and it kind of goes back to onboarding as well, we often would hire colleagues that come in with licenses. And one of the people in the chat actually asked, how do we manage licenses that would not be needed for the job role? So in our database, we actually have a category that says unsupported license type. So if the producer wants to keep their license, our connection to NIPR would continue to give us that license data and show it as active. So we would just mark that license as unsupported, meaning that the licensing team that does renewals would not include those licenses in their reports to action those items. So that's one way to manage it, because the licenses are the property of the producer, so we wouldn't just get rid of them, of course. Another thing that I wanted to discuss is a little bit about the affiliation process. You're right, there really is no best practice. We try to manage just doing sort of an audit to see where people might be missing an affiliation, if it could happen, because it's not part of the licensing process itself. So I'll often run reports on in states that require affiliation. So I'll look at active licenses and then We also track the affiliations in our database and see if there's any mismatch there. And then also I'm told that SBS has the ability to provide reports. I think you do have to pay for them for the agency. And then you could use those reports also to make sure that you're maintaining the list and terminating people that don't belong on the license, because from an agency perspective, that would just add risk that you don't need. And I know Lonnie was going to talk a little bit about product tracking.
Actually, for the continuing education and product training, I'll look at it a little more from a carrier standpoint. And obviously carriers are not really going to be concerned with the normal continuing education, because as long as we have proof that they are licensed, then we know that their continuing education is compliant. But product training is a different idea, because they have some state required product trainings, and then there's also carrier specific product trainings. An example of that would be annuity best interest, long-term care trainings. Each carrier has their own product trainings that they provide to producers and require, but then there's also the state requirements. So there's a couple different things that are necessary to track and ensure that the producer is compliant with before you allow them to write that product. So to make sure they complete that training is important, because it can affect the actual policy status. It can make the policy void, or you'd have to change the dates, or, and it could also affect whether or not the producer gets a commission payment if they were not properly licensed and trained prior to writing that business. I believe that a best practice for carriers would be to reject any business when all those requirements are not met. And I think it's in the carrier's best interest to have some kind of a system in place to identify the producer of record for all new business that comes in. It just will ensure that there's no business written for a non-compliant producer. In addition to the product training, carriers are responsible, obviously, for making sure that the producer is contracted and appointed as needed when that business is written. And a carrier should find a maintenance or tracking tool that would utilize the information from the PDB and state websites to make sure that that data is kept current. That kind of leads us into the just-in-time appointments, which is a tool that carriers can use to ensure compliance. There's been a significant change in the industry that is moving towards the just-in-time appointment process. For those states that permit it, it would mean that the carriers can wait to file an appointment until after that producer puts his first piece of business in. Then the appointment request is submitted to the state insurance department. This really wasn't something that was included with the PMLA, so there's not really any uniformity among the states when it comes to just-in-time appointments. So really, I know that we do have, multiple resources in the SILA library that would help you as far as the timing of when an appointment is required when that business is submitted. So you can also obviously check with the various states, but there are also many vendors out there that can help carriers in the appointment process and filing just-in-time appointments. From a benefit standpoint, just-in-time processing, I think, really helps you balance the need for compliance and then also managing your appointment and background check fees, because it would actually limit you paying for appointments and paying for backgrounds that producers that actually, submit business. With that, I guess we're going to talk about renewals.
Actually, I think I touched base on this a little bit, but I'll put it all into one concise statement, essentially. So you have a renewal process. Typically, your resident license is going to renew, and then you have your non-resident ones. Every state's a little bit different. Most states typically, like I said, renew every 2 years. but those renewal dates can be different. Some of them are the year that they issue, the year, date of birth. So there could be a variety of different reasons or different times that your actual non-resident licenses renew. But essentially you're going to renew, most of them typically will renew around the same time. I do know that they were trying to make that as uniform as possible. I think the thing that I just really want to stress out of all of this is the best practice of CE. If you do not complete your CE, your resident license will not be renewed, and your non-resident licenses will then no longer be, will all go down essentially. So it's just important that you get your CE done in a timely manner, which I know we're all preaching to each other about CE being done, but that's the part that sort of dictates the whole process.
From the carrier side of renewals, it's really obviously, again, not about the license, but more about the appointment renewals. That's going to be a state-specific process because some states are perpetual, some states don't do anything with appointments, and they all have varying expiration dates or terms for appointment renewals. A best practice would be for carriers to have an annual or regular review process that would generally correlate with the state appointment renewals for the states that are charging for ongoing appointments. From a cost saving perspective, annual reconciliation would be recommended to make sure that we have compliant producers, and then also avoid the cost of renewing appointments for non-producing agents. I know that there are, each carrier is going to have their own rules. Someone may say, okay, this person hasn't written business in the past year, so we're not going to renew their appointment. Or, some may say 6 months. Really just kind of, depends on what you come up with as a carrier. And then the other thing to consider when renewing or not renewing appointments is that each state may have specific requirements on how you notify that producer that you're not going to renew or that you're going to terminate their contract. For example, the state of Texas, if that producer has been contracted with the carrier for 2 years or longer, you have to give them a 6-month notification prior to terminating that appointment. I think that's all I have to say on the appointment renewals.
I guess I will jump right back in there with data maintenance and data maintenance tools and syncing. So essentially there's going to be like 3 rules of thought on this, or 3 approaches that you're going to have when it comes to how you manage your licensing data. The first one is typically going to be a vendor technology or a vendor that offers a licensing management tool. Typically, if not almost all of them these days, will report to, they've partnered with an IPR and do report to the PDB. So this is great when you have a very large organization where you've got over, hundreds of producers that are licensed to be able to manage that data. If it's connected to the PDB, the great thing about that is you can get real-time data along the way. So as licenses renew or they come down, you can be notified about that, or, there's a variety of different options. If you have shopped this out, know that there are a lot of different services that are offered. But just depending on what your organization's pain points are as far as management of your licenses is going to dictate the type of tool that you need and the services that they offer. And again, all of those there's a variety of them out there. The second type is going to be an internally built system. So this is going to be, again, for probably a larger organization, but they've actually internally built their system on their own. And they have partnered probably with a few other departments. HR would probably be one of them, where they have a system that communicates with their HR department. And then can also set a contract out with an IPR to report to the PDB. So those systems will typically have some sort of a syncing capability that will allow you to have real-time data throughout the day and, from day to day, especially if you're working on a time-sensitive matter. That's helpful. The third approach is for like smaller organizations. There are organizations out there, again, that may have like less than 100 licensed producers, and they actually manually maintain all of their licenses within a home-built system of some kind. That could be an Excel spreadsheet, that could be a variety of different technologies that are available out there. And they do not report to the PDB, but the reason again for that is because they're handling a small amount of licenses that do not require that real-time data. The real-time data is typically allows you to pull reports so you can get a holistic view of where your compliance stands as far as your company is concerned. These smaller organizations may not need that or can obtain that data just as quickly by going out to SBS to see what the status of their license is. These smaller firms also typically will go directly out to NIPR or any other vendor that allows for the renewal or applying of licenses. And they'll actually do all of that processing directly through NIPR to allow for them to go ahead and renew all of either apply or renew multiple states at a time. The other part to data maintenance tools and syncing is it's helpful for your change of address notifications and change of name. I'm going to primarily talk about change of address. Best practice on my end, as far as experience is concerned, we had partnered with our HR department. We had a system called Workday that we were able to flag our folks who were licensed. And then that essentially allowed them to create specific reports that were then sent on a weekly basis to our licensing department, notifying us of an address change or a name change or a position change. So if you have an address change and that person hit that report, it would notify our coordinator who handles address changes to process those. There are some vendors out there that you can actually process a change of address through their system, or typically people use NIPR. They'll leverage them and use their CCR system, which is relatively new, to be able to process those address changes. Gets a little trickier and much more complicated if you're going from state to state, which we'd be here all day if we had to talk about that. But those are ways that we notify. Change of name is the same way. If there was position changes, what that essentially would do is then start that audit process that I talked about earlier. So if we have somebody who moved from one position to another, we would take a look at essentially our matrix of licensing and identify where and how that person needed to be licensed, or identify that their licensing can remain the same, but it would trigger an audit for them. Danny, do you have any additional agency best practices?
I think you covered all of them. Just wanted to say that I've used both NIPR alerts and real-time syncing of the data, and they both are really helpful, but data is wonky and clumsy and still from some states not uniform. So there are still remaining challenges that require a management of exceptions, right? So some states, I won't name names, issue a new effective date every time a license renews. And that continually presents a challenge where we have to manually work those exceptions. So just in any data process, you always want to be aware that there's exceptions and have a management process of them.
Right.
Cool.
I think we're on to offboarding.
All right. Let's talk about some
I'll be a little bit quicker on this one. But essentially the last part to a license life cycle is offboarding or termination. Folks will leave a agency and there's usually a process that comes along with that. So, every organization is going to be a little bit different, and every organization is going to have a communication that's a little bit different, but essentially you're going to have some sort of communication with that licensed producer. We typically would receive a report, whether it be through Workday or other means of notification or reports that a person is separated from the company and no longer is there. So what that would trigger is our coordinator who handles terminations to put together what's called a termination package. And it had a letter with just general information on the front. Hi, you're licensed. I have enclosed a list of your licenses and your license numbers. And here's how you can maintain those, and then provide that producer those resources if they're interested in maintaining their licenses. We'd also send any additional documentation that we might have. So if there were exam scores and that's all that they've had, they haven't had any CE, then, you know, we would send those exam scores or CE certificates if they needed those so that they can provide those to their new employer if they're remaining in the insurance industry. But we would leave the onus of the actual management of their licenses to them and let them know, hey, here's a list, here's when they renew, and here's your license numbers, and here's where you go to take care of those. The other part to that, though, is that we also will process what's called disaffiliations. So if a person leaves the agency, then what we would do is notify our coordinator who would handle affiliations at the time, let them know, hey, this person was licensed here, 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 and here. And then they would take that. We managed ours through an Excel workbook. There's probably a variety of different ways that you can do that, but we would go ahead and process that disaffiliation for any folks who left the company. So that's kind of, you know, everybody's a little bit different on that, but essentially you're going to send out a communication of some kind to that producer. The other part to that we also would do is update their email address. Since many states require email addresses, we would go ahead and process that through CCR. We would have collected their personal email address on either the data sheet or the renewal questionnaire and have that information in our system. And then we would change that email address to ensure that that producer would be receiving the information going forward on any state correspondence they may have. That's all I have on it. Lonnie?
I know I touched a little bit on terminating agreements, and I know we're getting really short on time, and we want to be able to get to the next section for Tiffany to go through some NIPR slides. So I think if we're okay with that, we'll just move on to that for now.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Okay, I'm moving on to the next slide so we can invite our special guest star, Tiffany Dunges from NIPR.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And a big thank you to SILA for providing NIPR this opportunity to speak today. So we've obviously touched on a lot of different non-uniformity and different areas, but there are 4 key areas that I want to, or components that I want to show you today: Producer Licensing Model Act, the Uniform Licensing Standards, the State Licensing Handbook, and the NEIC uniform applications. These 4 areas assist the regulators in the insurance industry to move towards uniformity and best practices. And the Uniform Producer Licensing Model Act was, the NEIC members did pass that in 2000, and we've come a long way. But today I want to show you just a few things, such as the next slide will show you an example of the Commissioner's Dashboard. It's just an example that NIPR has established. And here you can see it shows the credentialing services for each state and which ones they utilize. And so this is a tool that we use to determine each state's compliance with the NEIC licensing model laws and best practices. The next slide will show you a little bit more into that detail. And so we have 6 technical best practices or areas that we like to focus on. The first being that insurance producer licensing type. So when the industry comes to us and they want to, through NIPR, and they're wanting to apply to for a non-resident licensing across the states, they want to select one common class line of license class, and then the 6 PLMA major lines of authority. What are those? You know, we need to look and outline each one of those, because we have to do the mapping and we want to make it as uniform and a best customer experience for each of our users. And then utilizing the ULS, Uniform Licensing Standards, for those 4 core limited lines. And then we look at the biannual birth month renewal cycle that was just touched on earlier, the state fees, and the 90-day window. So if I'm the applicant and I want to renew, say, 10 non-resident licenses, I want to be able to go in 90 days prior, maybe not 60, maybe not 100, 120, but on my birth month, I want to go in 90 days prior to my birth month renewal. And so this is kind of something that we've used as a tool to work with the states. And so on the next slide, I just want to kind of move on to, because I know we're running out of time, is focusing on new capabilities and expanding that state access. And so as we work with states on uniformity and recommending those best technical practices, we do look at those two main product types. We have the reporting that was discussed earlier, that NIPR, which used to be called IRIN. I'm glad that you pointed that out, was established in 1996, and we started gathering and capturing the state's data for you to do the reporting, to get those alerts. And then in 2000, we created the first product or credentialing application. That was the non-resident licensing application. And so with that, we moved on and we are reaching out. In 2022, we looked at those states. We worked with those states. In Kansas, I apologize, I'm losing my voice. Kansas, we were able to implement resident licensing renewals for individuals and business entities. We implemented new lines of authority and classes, and we modified their business requirements to be more uniform. And then we went into Massachusetts because we needed those appointments and terminations to come through NIPR. So now we have all jurisdictions coming through NIPR for appointments and terminations. We also looked at their licensing products and credentialing, and we modified them to be more uniform. And then finally, we reached out to Hawaii, and it took almost a year to roll out resident, non-resident licensing renewals for individuals and business entities. Again, new license classes and lines of authority. We modified those business requirements to be more uniform. We have now 19 new credentialing products for you. We are expanding state access to New York and Washington. We have ongoing communication and conversations with New York to roll out these products and services. In Washington, we are targeting Q3 or into Q4 for resident, non-resident licensing and renewals for business entities. We also are focusing and targeting for adjusters to come on board early of 2024. So this is some good, exciting news. Next, on appointments and terms, I just kind of want to do a quick status here. We're at 44 states with Massachusetts coming through us. And also, of those 44 states, none of them require that SSN now to protect personal identifiable information. So that SSN is no longer needed to come through the transaction gateway. And then we have 9 non-appointment states, which are outlined here. So with Massachusetts, we now have, if you would click next, we have 21 states that are doing appointment renewals. So Vermont, Kansas, and Massachusetts were our last 3. So the next slide, we will show you the adjuster designated home state. This is one of our newer products. We have 29 states for initials, 26 states on for renewals, and 32 states that are reporting that data to the PDB. And again, this is just for individuals. We have the no home state. We have for individuals, initials, 19 states. For business entities, we have 16. And then on the renewal side, we have 17 states that have been implemented for individuals and 15 states for business entities. Next slide, you will see for contact change request. So this was talked about earlier. It was initiated in 2007 and it was called address change request. We heard from you, you needed email, you needed phone changes. So we modified the name and we implemented what is now CCR. We have all states in production for individuals. And we heard you said, what about business entities? So now we rolled out the product for business entities. We are in 34 states across the country, working on a few others. And this product is growing. The next product that we're working on the next slide, would be our license update initiative. This is kind of a suite of products. First one is the demographic name update is for your primary name change. We have implemented for individuals and business entities to Connecticut and Rhode Island, and we're working on Missouri in Q2. We have designated responsible licensed producer, the ability to have that updated. And this is, we're working with Connecticut in Q2. So I ran through this really quickly. I know we're up at close to the end of the hour. And then we'll just, I'll turn it back over to Danny, Lonnie, or Nikki to continue.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much. We're so excited to hear those changes upcoming. I know there's a couple of questions in the chat and we have 2 or 3 minutes left. So I think we were going to have Julie help us with those questions.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. Some of them have been addressed either by other people that are participating in today's webinar or by SILA staff. So I'm going to kind of breeze through those, over those. Why doesn't NAIC forms have every state specific question? I don't know if you can answer all of these.
I can pipe in for that, even though I'm not a member of the NAIC. They are striving for uniformity, right? So they want the uniform questions to capture all of the information that's needed. And, the states reserve the rights to do what they want to do. But I know that the NAIC is primarily focused on uniformity.
Okay. What is the name of the onboarding form? Some of these came in while you were talking, so it was probably specific to a slide.
I think Lonnie, they were talking about the carrier forms.
About the Accord form,
Yep, and then there was a second.
the Accord 8, what is it, 821, right? No.
Yeah, and the PIF maybe.
Oh, it's also referred to as the PIF, the personal information form.
And then on the agency side, we sort of referred to it at, it was Nikki's forms, referred to it as a data sheet essentially. That's all it was. So it would just be a questionnaire that we would create in forms and send out. We call it a data sheet.
Okay, we are right up on our timeline, and there's just there are several more which we will address via email afterwards, but there was one that I just saw pop up. Could you explain the SBS difference from NIPR? So I think both of them were kind of talked about in the same slide.
Sure.
So Tiffany, you want to do it?
So I'm just wanting to make sure I understand the question. SBS is a back office system. And so just like your code your own states and you have Verta4. So those are 3 back office systems. NIPR handles all of the states and jurisdictions. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the industry to submit credentialing applications? They can submit it through NIPR. It's open to all states and jurisdictions.
Okay, well, I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. I think we could go on for another hour. This panel was fantastic. So much information. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. We will respond to questions via email afterwards. You will have access to a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the recording in the next few weeks. Watch for the notice for the May webinar on the intersection of insurance and securities. Remember that our webinars are public and free of charge. We really love it when you share our invitations with other people. And watch for and complete the post-webinar survey that you will get within the next month that will come out with the link to the recording and the presentation deck. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.